Hey guys, I wanted to do this video on what I call the musket myth. It's a misconception that the Second Amendment only applies to muskets because that's what the Founding Fathers knew. So I had a lot of fun making this video and I hope you guys enjoy it. You've probably heard this one before. The Second Amendment only applies to muskets. It's one of the most common arguments in gun debates, usually thrown around online. The idea is simple. The Founding Fathers couldn't have imagined modern firearms, so your rights should be limited to flintlocks or muskets. But is this really true? Today we're going to break down the myth with history, law, and a little bit of common sense. When people say the Second Amendment only applies to muskets, they're usually making two big assumptions. One, that the Founding Fathers only knew about single shot muzzle loading weapons, and two, that they couldn't imagine future advancements. But history tells us a different story. While muskets were common, they were far from the only firearms in existence. By the late 1700s, weapons technology had already begun branching out in fascinating ways. Let's start with the Girandoni air rifle, invented in Austria in 1779. This was a 46 caliber repeating rifle that carried a tubular magazine of 20 rounds. That's right, 20 shots before needing to reload. It used compressed air instead of black powder and was so advanced that the Austrian military actually issued it to troops. The founders knew about it too. Thomas Jefferson gave one to the Lewis and Clark expedition in 1803. Imagine how mind-blowing that must have been compared to the standard musket. Then we have the Puckle gun. Invented in 1718, decades before the Revolution, it was essentially a tripod-mounted, hand-cranked, flintlock gun that could fire multiple shots in succession. Some call it an early machine gun. But while it wasn't widely adopted, it does show that the concept of rapid-fire weapons was absolutely known long before the Constitution was written. Let's not forget the Ferguson rifle. Developed between 1774 and 1776, this was a breech-loaded flintlock rifle that could be reloaded while laying down, not just standing up like a musket. It gave a much higher rate of fire and more tactical flexibility. Some British troops even used it during the Revolutionary War. All of this tells us that the Founding Fathers were not stuck in the idea that firearms would always be single-shot muzzle loaders. They had already seen repeating, breech loading, and even semi-automatic style concepts. Now here's something else to think about. Technology was advancing in every field at the time. The founders saw the evolution of printing, navigation, shipbuilding, and various sciences. Benjamin Franklin himself was an inventor, tinkering with electricity and bifocal glasses. These men were not short-sighted. They were fully expecting that weapons, just like everything else, would continue to evolve. And this is why the language of the Second Amendment is so important. They didn't just say the right of the people to keep and bear muskets. They said arms. That word was intentionally broad, and it covered all manners of weapons, the ones they had, the ones they knew were coming, and the ones they couldn't yet imagine. To drive this home, let's look at a parallel. The First Amendment protects free speech and the press. At the time, that meant quill pens, parchment, and wooden printing presses. If we applied the same logic as muskets only myth, the First Amendment wouldn't apply to microphones, telephones, radio, TV, or the internet. But of course it does. The principle, free expression, transcends the technology. The same applies to the Second Amendment and arms. So the historical record is clear. The Founding Fathers lived in a world where advanced firearms existed, and they deliberately wrote the Second Amendment in a way that would endure through technological progress. The musket myth isn't just misleading, it ignores the very foresight that the Founding Fathers had when they framed the Bill of Rights. Now that we've taken a look at the historical context, let's talk about the legal perspective. The claim that the Second Amendment only applies to muskets has not only been debunked by history, it's been rejected by the courts for over a century. Let's start with an important point. The courts don't interpret the Constitution based on obsolete technology. The Constitution is written to protect principles, and the courts have consistently affirmed that. Let's start with one of the earliest and most important cases for the Second Amendment in the United States. The United States versus Miller in 1939. In this case, two men were arrested for transporting a short-barreled shotgun without paying the $200 tax under the National Firearms Act. The Supreme Court didn't rule against gun ownership itself. Instead, it said that the Second Amendment protects weapons that have a reasonable relationship to the preservation or efficiency of a well-regulated militia. The court actually implied that if a weapon could be shown as useful for militia purposes, it would fall under the Second Amendment protection. Even in 1939, the court was not saying that the right was limited to muskets. It was looking at whether the arm in question was militarily relevant. Fast forward almost 70 years to District of Columbia versus Heller, 2008. This was the landmark decision where the Supreme Court ruled that the Second Amendment protects an individual's right to keep and bear arms, not just a collective militia right. Justice Scalia, writing for the majority, made it crystal clear. The Second Amendment protects arms in common use, for lawful purposes like self-defense. Importantly, Scalia also addressed the musket myth directly, saying that the Second Amendment extends to all bearable arms, even those not in existence at the time of the founding. The line alone completely undercuts the musket-only argument. Shortly after came McDonald v. Chicago, 2010, which extended the Heller ruling to apply against state and local governments. That meant that the Second Amendment isn't just a federal limitation, it also binds the state and city laws. Again, no language here suggests the right is frozen in the 18th century. Most recently, as of date recorded, we have New York State Rifle and Pistol Association v. Bruen in 2022. This case struck down New York's restrictive concealed carry law, but more importantly, it established a new test for evaluating gun laws. The court said modern gun regulations must be consistent with the nation's historical tradition of firearm regulation. That doesn't mean only muskets are protected. What it means is, if a regulation today doesn't align with the way firearms were regulated historically, it's on shaky ground. Once again, the court affirmed that the Second Amendment covers modern firearms in common use. When you look at this legal history, the pattern is clear. From Miller to Heller, McDonald, and Bruen, the courts have consistently treated the Second Amendment as applying to modern arms, not just the muskets and flintlocks of old. The idea that the Constitution only protects muskets has never been a legal reality. It's more of a political talking point than a serious constitutional argument. So both historically and legally, the musket myth just doesn't hold up. The courts recognize the Second Amendment like the rest of the Bill of Rights. It's about enduring principles, not outdated hardware. The Second Amendment wasn't written to freeze people in 1791 when the Bill of Rights was ratified. It was written to ensure that citizens could defend themselves, hunt, and act as a check against tyranny. The Founding Fathers understood that principle, and that an armed populace is harder to control, and they deliberately left the language broad. Whether you agree with modern gun policy or not, the claim that the Second Amendment only covers muskets is not backed by a history, law, or logic for that matter. So, no, I don't think the Second Amendment is about muskets. It's about arms, and in 1791, today, and into the future, I hope that those arms remain protected. I really had fun making this video, and if you guys have any comments or questions about it, drop a comment and I will respond. And thanks for watching, guys.